Hi, I'm Mira. Welcome to another story. Let's see where this one takes us. The control room thrummed with the familiar hum of the core, its faint light pulsing through the conduits like a heartbeat. Renn Calder stood at the main console, their brow furrowed as they stared at the readings. Something was wrong. The core's energy flow was irregular, the once steady patterns of its output now lurching erratically. The glowing tendrils encasing the central chamber pulsed in uneven bursts, casting flickering shadows across the walls. Renn adjusted the analyzer, their fingers tapping a nervous rhythm against the panel. The data didn't make sense. For centuries, the core had been the city's lifeline, sustaining every system and keeping their underground metropolis alive. But now, its patterns weren't just unstable, they were deliberate, like a signal struggling to be understood. The sharp click of boots on metal echoed behind them. Renn didn't need to look to know it was Elric Dallon, the overseer of the city's infrastructure. His presence was always announced by the cold efficiency of his movements and the tension he carried like a weapon. "Report," Dallon demanded, his tone curt and clipped. "The core's destabilizing," Renn said without turning. "Its energy output is dropping, and the fluctuations aren't random, they're patterned." "Patterned?" Dallon stepped closer, his eyes narrowing at the screen. "Are you suggesting this is deliberate?" "I don't know," Renn admitted. "But the core isn't just failing, it's doing something." "Fix it," Dallon said sharply, cutting off any further speculation. "The council doesn't care about your theories. If the core fails, the city dies. You know what's at stake." Renn bit back a retort, their frustration simmering beneath the surface. Dallon was right about one thing. Without the core, their entire way of life would collapse. But he didn't understand. There was more to this than a simple malfunction. Renn could feel it, a tension in the air that went beyond the hum of the core. Something was waking up. That evening, Renn pored over the schematics in their dimly lit workshop. The core's original design was ancient, predating the city's recorded history. Its function was clear, energy production and regulation, but its origins were shrouded in secrecy. Even the council, with all their authority, didn't know who had built it. All they knew was that it worked. Until now. The data scrolled across Renn's screen, the patterns becoming more distinct with every analysis. They leaned forward, their eyes narrowing. It wasn't just a signal, it was a message. Coordinates. But coordinates to what? "You look like you've seen a ghost." Renn jumped, spinning around to see a woman leaning casually against the doorway. She was dressed in a simple utility jacket, her posture relaxed, but her sharp eyes glinting with mischief. Lyra Vayne, the city's most notorious historian, or troublemaker depending on who you asked. "What are you doing here?" Renn demanded, their voice low. "I could ask you the same thing," Lyra replied, stepping into the room. "But I think I already know." Renn's jaw tightened. "You have no idea what you're talking about." Lyra grinned, unbothered by the dismissal. "Don't I? I've been studying the core for years, trying to figure out why it was built, and now it's sending a message. You've seen it, haven't you?" Renn hesitated, their fingers tightening around the edge of the console. "What do you know about it?" "More than the council wants me to," Lyra said, her voice softening. "The core wasn't just made to keep us alive, it was made to keep us here, underground, away from the surface." Renn's breath caught. "The surface is uninhabitable, that's why the laws exist." "That's what they want you to believe," Lyra countered. "But the core's message says otherwise. Those coordinates, it's pointing us to something up there, something they don't want us to find." "You don't know that," Renn said, though the doubt in their voice was clear. "Maybe not," Lyra admitted. "But you're curious, aren't you? You wouldn't be analysing this data if you weren't." Renn closed their eyes, taking a deep breath. Every instinct told them to ignore her, to follow Dallon's orders and focus on stabilising the core. But the patterns wouldn't leave them alone. The message was too clear to ignore. "If we do this," Renn said finally, "there's no going back." Lyra's grin widened. "Then let's make it worth it." They set out under the cover of darkness, slipping through the maintenance levels with quiet precision. The coordinates led them to a sealed access hatch buried beneath layers of rust and grime. Renn's hands worked quickly, bypassing locks and decrypting codes while Lyra kept watch. As the hatch creaked open, a faint breeze swept through the corridor, carrying with it the scent of fresh air. Renn hesitated. their heart pounding as they stared into the darkness beyond. "Ready?" Lyra asked, her voice steady. Renn nodded, stepping forward. The hum of the core faded behind them, replaced by the quiet promise of the unknown. The staircase beyond the hatch spiraled upward into darkness, its steps worn and uneven. Renn and Lyra moved cautiously, their breaths echoing in the confined space. The faint breeze drifting down carried with it the cool scent of earth and something sharp, almost metallic. It was a scent neither of them recognized, and it set Renn's nerves on edge. "You're awfully quiet," Lyra said, her voice hushed but teasing. She glanced back at Renn, her expression unreadable in the dim light. "Focused," Renn muttered, gripping the handrail. "This staircase hasn't been used in decades. For all we know, it could collapse." "Ah, the voice of optimism," Lyra replied with a smirk, though her own steps were careful. The climb felt endless, each step taking them further from the familiar hum of the core. The walls, once sleek and metallic, began to shift into rough stone. Dust clung to every surface, disturbed only by their passage. Renn couldn't shake the feeling that they were crossing some invisible threshold, leaving behind the order of the city and entering a world that wasn't meant for them. "You think anyone's been up here before?" Renn asked, breaking the silence. "If they have, they didn't leave any breadcrumbs," Lyra replied. "This staircase wasn't in any of the maps I found. Either the council doesn't know about it, or they don't want anyone to know." "Convenient," Renn muttered. The thought didn't comfort them. At last they reached the top. A second hatch loomed before them, this one simpler in design. Its wheel lock was heavily corroded, the metal pitted with rust. Lyra stepped forward, inspecting it with a frown. "Looks ancient," she said, running her fingers along the grooves. "But it's intact." Renn nodded, taking out their tools. The wheel lock screeched in protest as they turned it, their arms straining against the resistance. With a final, reluctant groan, the mechanism gave way and the hatch swung open. Light flooded the staircase, blinding in its intensity. Renn shielded their eyes, blinking rapidly as they adjusted to the sudden brightness. Cool air rushed in, carrying a strange mix of scents, grass, soil, and something faintly metallic. Lyra stepped through first, her movements careful but eager. Renn followed, their boots crunching against loose gravel as they emerged onto the surface. The world before them was vast and alien. The sky stretched endlessly above, a brilliant blue that seemed impossibly high. Jagged mountains framed the horizon, their peaks dusted with patches of white. The ground was a mix of rocky terrain and sparse vegetation, tufts of grass swaying in a breeze that felt impossibly clean compared to the filtered air of the city. Lyra let out a low whistle, her eyes wide as she took in the view. "Well, they weren't lying about one thing. This place is nothing like home." Renn nodded mutely, their gaze darting between the strange sights. The light, the openness, it was overwhelming. For their entire life, the city had been their world, a closed system of metal and machinery. This was something else entirely, something alive. But it wasn't just the beauty of the surface that caught their attention. It was the silence. There was no hum, no vibration, no constant reminder of the core. The quiet was almost oppressive. "This is it," Lyra said softly, kneeling to run her fingers through the grass. "The surface, the place they've been keeping us away from." Renn glanced at her, their unease growing. "It's empty." Lyra straightened, her brow furrowing. "What do you mean? Where are the people?" Renn asked, gesturing at the horizon. "If this was our home before the city, where is everyone? There's no sign of life, no cities, no structures, nothing." Lyra's expression darkened. "Maybe they left, or maybe something drove them away." Renn didn't reply. They scanned the horizon, their eyes narrowing as something caught their attention, a faint glint of metal, half buried in the ground. They approached it cautiously, kneeling to brush away the dirt. "What is it?" Lyra asked, joining them. Renn frowned, holding up a jagged piece of machinery. Its surface was corroded, but its design was unmistakable. It's part of the core." Lyra's eyes widened. "What?" "There's more," Renn said, their voice tight. They gestured to the ground, where pieces of similar machinery were scattered like the remnants of a forgotten battle. Each fragment pulsed faintly, emitting the same rhythmic glow as the core back in the city. Lyra crouched beside them, her fingers tracing the edge of one fragment. The core wasn't just made for the city, it came from here. Renn's mind raced, piecing together the implications. This wasn't just a home, it was a testing ground. The core, it wasn't built to sustain us, it was built to contain something. As the words left their mouth, a distant rumble shook the ground beneath their feet. Renn and Lyra exchanged a panicked glance before turning toward the horizon. The mountains seemed to tremble, and a massive silhouette began to rise against the sky. It was mechanical, yet alive. Tendrils of light snaked across its form, pulsing with the same energy as the core. The ground quaked with each step as it began to move toward them, its glowing eyes locking onto their position. "Run!" Lyra whispered, her voice trembling. Renn didn't hesitate. They grabbed her arm, pulling her back toward the hatch as the behemoth let out a deafening roar. The surface wasn't a refuge, it was a warning. The roar of the behemoth was deafening, a guttural blend of machinery and life that reverberated through the ground. Renn and Lyra scrambled back toward the hatch, their breaths coming in panicked bursts. The air itself seemed to shudder with the creature's movements, each step sending tremors across the landscape. Dust and debris rose in clouds as its glowing tendrils snaked out, pulsing with energy that was eerily familiar. "We can't outrun that thing!" Lyra shouted, her voice barely audible over the cacophony. "Then we need to outthink it!" Renn yelled back, their mind racing. They reached the hatch and yanked it open, their hands shaking as they waved Lyra inside. "Get down there! What about you?" Lyra hesitated, her eyes darting between Renn and the approaching monstrosity. "I'll follow!" Renn insisted. "Just go!" Lyra gave a reluctant nod and disappeared down the staircase. Renn lingered for a heartbeat, their eyes locked on the behemoth. It wasn't just alive, it was purposeful. Its movements were deliberate, its gaze fixed on the hatch as though it recognized them as intruders. The hum of its glowing tendrils was almost identical to the core, but louder, more primal. "This thing isn't just connected to the core," Renn muttered to themselves. "It is the core." The realization hit like a punch to the gut. Whatever the core was sustaining below, this creature was its origin, or perhaps its counterpart. The city wasn't powered by technology alone. It was tethered to something alive, something monstrous. The behemoth roared again, its tendrils slicing through the air. Renn ducked into the hatch just as the ground beneath them cracked, the shockwave nearly knocking them off their feet. They slammed the hatch shut, bolting it tight before sliding down the staircase to where Lyra was waiting. "Care to explain what just happened?" Lyra demanded, her voice trembling despite her attempt at bravado. "It's the core," Renn said breathlessly, "or at least a part of it. That thing is linked to everything we've ever known, the energy, the laws, the restrictions. They're all about keeping us down there, away from it." Lyra's eyes narrowed. "So what? The city was built to protect us from that thing? No," Renn said, shaking their head. "To protect it from us." They hurried back to the maintenance levels, their minds reeling. The hum of the core grew louder as they approached, its rhythm faster, almost frantic. It was as though the core itself had sensed the behemoth's awakening. Inside the control nexus, Renn began pulling up data, their hands moving in a blur over the console. Lyra paced behind them, her movements restless. "What are you doing?" "Trying to figure out how the core's connection to that thing works," Renn said. "If it's part of the system, maybe we can shut it down." Lyra stopped mid-step, her expression dark. "And if we can't?" Renn didn't answer. They didn't need to. The answer was written in the way their shoulders tensed, the way their fingers trembled over the keys. The console beeped and new schematics flooded the screen. Renn leaned closer, their hearts sinking as the data became clear. The core isn't just linked to the behemoth, it's tributes the energy. We've been sustaining it this whole time. Lyra's face twisted in disbelief. "You're telling me the city's survival depends on keeping that thing alive?" "Yes," Renn said, their voice heavy. "And if we stop, the city dies," Lyra finished, her tone bitter. "Great. Fantastic." The room trembled, the vibrations growing stronger. Renn glanced at the screen, their eyes widening. "It's coming closer, it's drawn to the core." "Then we have to stop it," Lyra said, her voice resolute. "If that thing reaches the city, it won't matter how much energy it's been feeding it. It'll destroy everything." Renn hesitated, their mind torn between choices. Shutting down the core would sever the connection, but it would also leave the city without power. Millions of lives hung in the balance, and there was no guarantee the behemoth would stop. "We could overload it," Renn said suddenly. "Flood the core with energy. It might destabilize the behemoth, force it to retreat." "And destroy the city in the process?" Lyra asked, incredulous. "It's a chance," Renn said. "A slim one, but it's better than letting that thing tear everything apart." Lyra stared at them, her jaw tightening. "You're willing to risk everything for this?" Renn met her gaze, their voice steady. "I'm willing to fight for a future where we're not just feeding a monster." With Lyra's help, Renn rerouted the core's energy flow, redirecting every available resource into a single, focused output. The hum of the core grew deafening, its light flaring brighter and brighter until the entire room was bathed in white. The console sparked and hissed, warning alarms blaring as the overload began. Outside, the behemoth froze mid-step, its tendrils thrashing wildly. It roared. The sound a mix of fury and pain as the connection between it and the core began to unravel. The ground shook violently and the lights across the city flickered, plunging the metropolis into darkness. "Come on," Renn muttered, their hands gripping the console. "Just a little more." The final surge of energy erupted through the core, sending a shockwave that rippled outward. The behemoth let out a deafening wail before collapsing, its glowing tendrils dimming as it crumpled into a motionless heap. The room fell silent. Renn and Lyra stared at the console, its screens dark and lifeless. The core's hum was gone, leaving a void that felt impossibly loud. "What now?" Lyra asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Renn exhaled, their shoulders slumping. "Now we rebuild, without the core, without the lies." Lyra nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips, "and without feeding monsters." Together, they stepped into the quiet, darkened city, their path uncertain but their resolve unshaken. Thanks for listening. If the story stuck with you, come back next time for another journey.